He didn't see a man, he saw a target. Those were the first words Commander Walter Dean spoke when he opened his eyes in the hospital, blood drying on his shoulder. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't a threat. He was a retired Navy officer jogging 2 blocks from his home. But to one young officer with a finger on the trigger, that didn't matter. What happened that morning wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a decision. And decisions like that don't just break bodies, they fracture trust, they shake neighborhoods, they echo across generations. This story isn't about revenge. It's about reckoning. About what it takes to be seen not just as a citizen, but as a human being. You're here for a reason. So tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? It was just before dawn, that tender slice of morning when the world hasn't quite woken up, but the air already hums with possibility. The sky still held the navy hue of night, slowly surrendering to the bruised pink of morning, while a thin layer of mist hovered low along the sidewalks of the quiet neighborhood. Streetlights blinked in amber tones along Sycamore Lane, their glow soft and familiar, bathing the empty street in a kind of borrowed safety. Commander Walter Dean, 61 years old, built like a man who'd never forgotten discipline, moved steadily through the chill, his breath forming gentle clouds that vanished into the breaking light. Each step was deliberate, rhythmic, and quiet, as though his body were reciting a prayer it had known by heart for years. This jog wasn't about exercise anymore. It was reflection. It was order. It was the one piece of control he still held onto after a lifetime of answering to chaos. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, gym shorts, and worn-out sneakers that whispered against the concrete. No music, no distractions. Just the sound of his own breath, the soft thud of his feet, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Walter had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade now, nestled just far enough from the city to feel private, but close enough to keep a sense of the world's pulse. He liked it that way, predictable, peaceful. Or so he thought. As he reached the corner of Willow and Crestwood, he caught sight of headlights slowly turning onto the street behind him. Nothing unusual. Patrol cars circled often at this hour, especially after the recent uptick in break-ins, and Walter always made sure to give a nod, a wave, just to signal that everything was fine. But this time the lights didn't roll past him. They stopped, jolted even, abruptly. Tires screeched slightly against the pavement, and the cruiser cut across the road, blocking his path like a gate slammed shut without warning. Walter stopped in his tracks, unsure whether to step forward or back, frozen by a sense that something in the air had changed. He took a breath and tried to reason with himself. Routine check. Maybe someone reported suspicious activity. Still, his pulse quickened. His instincts, sharpened over 30 years of naval command, told him this wasn't routine. The driver's door swung open fast, like it had been kicked from the inside. Out stepped a young white officer, mid-30s, lean with sharp features and a stare that didn't match the calm of the neighborhood. His right hand hovered over the holster at his side. His shoulders were tight, lips pressed thin like a man already building a narrative in his mind before hearing a word. "Freeze!" "Don't move!" the officer shouted, voice cracking through the morning stillness like a whip. Walter blinked, startled, not by the command itself, but by the tone. No introduction, no context, just immediate tension. He raised his hands halfway, palms out, heart beating harder, now not from exertion, but from a rising wave of disbelief. "I live here," Walter said calmly, eyes, steady, voice controlled with the grace of someone used to authority. "I'm just jogging. My house is 2 blocks down." But the officer didn't relax. He stepped closer, one hand gripping his flashlight, the other still twitching near his firearm. "Jogging, huh? At 5:45 in the morning, you got any ID on you?" Walter nodded slowly, barely breathing. "I've got my military tag on my wrist," he answered, lifting his arm just a few inches to indicate the watch he always wore when he ran. The officer flinched. His flashlight beam jumped with the motion, catching Walter's eyes and making him squint. "Don't move," the cop barked again, louder, now more frantic. Walter stopped, arms, frozen legs tensing beneath him. "Officer," he said, slower now, softer, like he was speaking to a man on the edge of something fragile. "I'm not armed. I'm not a threat. I've served this country longer than you've probably been on the force." His voice cracked slightly, not with fear, but with the deep exhaustion of a man who couldn't believe he had to explain his humanity yet again. Not in some faraway country, but here on his own street, in his own neighborhood before breakfast. Then came the sound sharp, metallic final. A single shot rang out and broke the world in two. Walter staggered backward, eyes, wide arms reaching instinctively for his chest. Pain bloomed instantly in his left shoulder like fire bursting behind his ribcage, stealing the air from his lungs. He dropped to his knees, the concrete cold and brutal beneath him. "Oh God," he whispered, not as a prayer, but as an anchor, as if naming something divine might keep him tethered to consciousness. Blood warmed the fabric of his t-shirt, running freely down his side. His right hand clutched the wound, pressure useless against the panic rising in his throat. The officer stood motionless, gun, still drawn face, pale mouth, slightly agape. It was as if time had stopped for him too, like he hadn't expected the bullet to be real, hadn't expected consequence to arrive this fast. Walter tried to focus to see the man's face clearly, but everything began to blur. Colors ran together. The sky turned watery. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. "You shot me," he murmured the words dragging from his mouth like bricks. Then he pointed as best he could to the chain around his wrist, blood now staining the silver links. "ID. Navy," he rasped. "I'm a commander." And just before the world slipped out from under him, he heard the officer's voice again. But this time it wasn't firm, or angry, or self-assured. It trembled. "Oh no," the officer said, barely audible. "Oh God, what have I done?" And in that moment, somewhere between breath and silence, Walter knew the bullet wasn't just meant for his body. It was aimed at his dignity, his belonging, his very right to be seen as human. Walter Dean wasn't just another black man out for a jog. He was a man carved out of history of duty and quiet sacrifice, a man who had walked through fire in silence and never asked for applause. From the moment he turned 18, he had pledged his life to the United States Navy, working his way up over 3 long decades to the rank of commander, a title he never flaunted but always carried with pride in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he listened. His discipline was not performative, it was lived, etched into every part of his being like calluses formed from years of ship decks, briefings, and decisions made in high-stakes silence. Even after retirement, Walter never truly stepped away from service, he just shifted its form. At the local Veterans Center, he volunteered weekly, mentoring young former soldiers who came home with invisible scars and had no idea how to re-enter civilian life. He helped with housing paperwork, made calls on their behalf, sat beside them in courtrooms when no one else would show. He remembered what it felt like to be 22 with a body full of pain and a head full of noise, trying to act normal in a world that couldn't comprehend what you'd seen. "What you've done doesn't define you," he'd say to them, resting one heavy hand on a trembling shoulder. "But what you do next will." The neighborhood knew him not by uniform or medals, but by kindness, constancy, and a rhythm as predictable as the mailman's route. He greeted every neighbor by name, waved at kids on their bikes, offered a quiet nod to older couples watering their lawns. Some called him Walt, others Sir, but most just smiled and said "Morning, Commander" as he passed. It wasn't out of deference to his military rank, but out of the unspoken recognition that he brought something steady and good to the community, like an oak tree planted on a quiet street. Yet even in a place that felt safe, Walter never forgot the rules. Not the Navy rules, those were ingrained, but the unwritten rules that black men of his generation memorized the way others learned prayers. Don't run at night. Keep your hands visible. Speak clearly, respectfully, and never ever reach too fast for anything, even if it's just your ID. He followed those rules not because he feared people, but because he'd seen what could happen when you didn't. And yet, after all these years, he still believed in this country, still believed that if he lived with integrity, if he served well, raised his family well, gave back, stayed quiet, obeyed every law, that maybe, just maybe, he'd be safe in the land. He defended. His wife Teresa had often worried about his morning jogs. "You know how people look at us even here," she'd whisper in the early hours as he laced up his shoes. "Especially when you're out there in that old hoodie before the sun's even up." But Walter would just smile gently and kiss her cheek. "I need it, Resa. It clears my head. Besides, I've walked darker places and come back. This is home." That sense of home meant something to Walter. He'd chosen this neighborhood for its tree-lined streets and nearby nature trails, yes, but also because it felt like a promise that he could finally exhale, be still, and grow old with dignity. The house he bought was modest, but filled with light, filled with the sound of jazz vinyl spinning in the evenings and the smell of cinnamon from his wife's Sunday baking. Their daughter Darlene had moved back to finish grad school nearby, and their son Malcolm visited every other weekend from the base in Norfolk. Family dinners were loud, filled with laughter, spades, games, and low-simmering debates about politics, God, and the world. It was a good life. Not perfect, not easy, but good. And yet, for all the honor and structure Walter carried, there was always an undercurrent, something unspoken that lived in his bones, something he never fully admitted to anyone, not even himself. It was the knowledge that no matter how straight you walked, how high you rose, how many years you served, there were still people in this country who would see nothing but the color of your skin and the time on the clock. And that morning, as the blood soaked through the cotton of his shirt, he realized just how thin the line between neighbor and suspect could be. As he lay there, his body heavy breath ragged, Walter's mind wasn't racing, it was slowing. His thoughts moved like waves, rising and falling in snapshots. His first deployment in the Pacific, the night he watched a young sailor cry himself to sleep, the way his daughter's hand fit in his when she was 6, the proud tears in his mother's eyes at his promotion ceremony. They came like visions, not of fear, but of meaning, of everything that had led him here. And still, in the midst of pain, confusion, and betrayal, he held on to one simple truth: he was not ashamed. He had nothing to hide. He had walked with honor, loved with patience, served with grit, and moved through this world as a man who chose purpose over bitterness. He had done everything right. And if this was how it ended, bleeding on the sidewalk with a badge pointed at his chest, then it wasn't his shame to carry. It was someone else's. Mason Cole wasn't born a monster. He was born in a town that mistook silence for civility, where prejudice was baked into backyard jokes and passed off as harmless tradition, where unspoken suspicion lingered in the glance of store clerks and the locking of car doors at stoplights. He grew up in a county where black boys were described as troublemakers by second grade, where local cops patted their holsters when they saw teenagers in hoodies, and where the evening news was more folklore than fact. His father, a retired corrections officer, rarely spoke of fairness. He spoke of control. "You don't hesitate," he'd tell Mason with a hard stare over dinner. "You hesitate, you end up dead." Mason took those words to heart, early absorbing them like gospel, even before he understood what they meant. He wasn't the worst kid in school, but he was the one who stared too long, clenched his jaw too fast, believed too quickly that the world was split into threats and order. By high school, he had learned how to size people up by their walk, how to read imagined tension in every face that didn't look like his own. When he applied to the police academy, it wasn't because he had a deep sense of justice or some calling to serve. It was because authority made him feel safe, and the badge gave him permission to impose his version of right and wrong. He passed his classes, met the physical standards, memorized procedures. But he never once examined his fear, never once questioned why a black man reaching into his glove compartment made his heart hammer, even when there was no threat in sight. He was praised for being alert, always ready, not one to second-guess, as his instructors called it. But beneath the surface of that praise was something far more dangerous, a young man with a narrow mind, a swollen ego, and no real preparation for complexity. He learned to speak the language of professionalism, but deep down Mason Cole was scared. Scared of being weak, scared of being disrespected, scared of losing control. That fear sat with him every night he put on the uniform, riding shotgun beside him in the patrol car. The neighborhood he transferred into was unfamiliar, more diverse, more quiet than the one he came from, but that didn't ease his tension. If anything, it heightened it. He couldn't say why exactly, but every time he saw a black man walking alone at night, something in him braced like a fist. He'd grip the steering wheel tighter, lower the volume on the radio, and let his mind wander to worst-case scenarios. His partner once asked him offhand, "Why do you always look tense in this part of town?" Mason shrugged it off. "Just being cautious," he replied. But inside, he wasn't just cautious. He was on edge, always waiting for something to go wrong so he could prove he was right to worry. That morning, as he rolled down Sycamore Lane, half an hour left in his shift, he felt that familiar itch of restlessness in his chest. It was quiet, too quiet, he thought. The kind of silence that made him feel useless, like just another wheel spinning for nothing. He hated that feeling. Hated the thought that maybe, just maybe, nothing was happening, because nothing needed to. Then, like a flicker in the fog, he saw him a lone figure jogging up the sidewalk, steady, focused, not hurried, not suspicious by any objective measure. But Mason didn't see composure. He saw motion size and unfamiliarity. A black man alone before 6 in the morning, wearing dark clothes, running toward his vehicle. His stomach tensed. His foot tapped the brake. His thoughts spiraled. He slowed the cruiser eyes, locked on the figure like a hunter studying movement. "Who jogs this early?" he muttered to himself, reaching for the radio, then stopping short. His training told him to observe, assess, engage calmly, but instinct roared louder than protocol. "He doesn't look like he belongs here," Mason said under his breath, though he couldn't have explained what belonging meant. He flicked on the headlights, cut the wheel hard, and blocked the sidewalk with the nose of the car. The man stopped, startled but not hostile. Mason stepped out, one hand on his flashlight, the other hovering too close to his gun. "Freeze! Don't move!" he snapped louder than necessary, the command cutting into the morning like glass. The jogger's eyes met his steady, alert, but calm, too calm. It unnerved Mason. The man raised his hands slightly, said something about living nearby, about going for a jog. Mason didn't really hear it. He heard the cadence, not the words. He saw the muscles, not the posture. He felt threat even where there was none. The man spoke again. "I've got ID on my wrist," gesturing to his arm in a way Mason didn't like. It was slow, measured, but to him it looked calculated. He felt his breathing quicken. His fingers curled tighter around the grip of his weapon. He didn't want to shoot. Not really. He wasn't the kind of man who went out looking for blood. But in that moment he felt cornered by his own fear, trapped in a story he didn't write but believed in too deeply to escape. And so when the man adjusted his shoulder barely instinctively, Mason's mind made the leap his heart had already prepared for. He pulled the trigger not out of malice, but out of the kind of fear that pretends to be certainty, the kind that's been nurtured by years of unchecked bias and the illusion of danger. And when the man fell, when blood bloomed on the gray fabric and the silence returned heavier than before, Mason didn't feel victory. He felt nausea. The gun hung heavy in his hand. The air seemed thinner. The world, for all its gray and blue uniforms, had just shifted beneath him. He took a step forward, knees locked, mouth dry. Then the jogger looked up, breath-ragged voice, weak but firm, and said something that shook Mason to his core. "I'm a Navy commander. My house is right there." Mason didn't answer. Couldn't. All he could do was stare at the military ID, now slick with blood, and realize too late that everything he'd just done, every assumption, every twitch, every unspoken fear had led to this. Not a hero's act, but a tragedy of his own making. The moment the shot rang out, the world seemed to lose its balance. Time fractured and sound bent unnaturally, like it had been sucked into a tunnel, muffled and stretched by disbelief. Walter Dean felt the bullet before he understood it had left the barrel. A hot, ripping pain tore through his left shoulder, immediate and sharp, like someone had shoved a burning iron into his flesh. He gasped, staggered a step backward, and instinctively pressed his right hand to the source of the pain, already feeling warm. Blood slick against his fingertips, seeping through the cotton of his shirt in thick, blooming pulses. His knees buckled without warning, and the ground came up too fast, concrete, scraping, skin cold against bone, hard in a way that left no room for confusion. He was hit. He had been shot. And for a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breath, catching in shallow stutters, each inhale thinner than the last. Above him, the sky was soft with morning light, pale blue behind the branches of the oak trees that lined the street birds, beginning to stir in the distance, as if none of this should be happening here in a place meant for peace. Walter blinked hard, trying to steady his vision, but the edges blurred, and his thoughts felt as scattered as the leaves around his feet. Pain radiated through his arm and chest like electricity, sharp and invasive, interrupting every signal from his brain. He tried to speak, but his voice came out in a whisper, broken and raw. I live here," he managed, choking slightly on the words. "I'm just jogging. The officer didn't move at first. He stood frozen, a statue with smoke curling gently from the muzzle of his gun, his eyes wide, his mouth half open in horror. The tension that had puffed his chest only seconds earlier had vanished, replaced by a brittle silence that hung between them like a wire pulled taut. Mason Cole looked down at the man he had just shot. Not a threat, not a criminal, but an older man, now curled on the sidewalk, bleeding, breathing, hard eyes, still focused and human and full of pain. His own breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he had done. "No," he whispered, stepping back a half-pace, hands trembling. "No, no, no." Walter, struggling against the pain, forced his hand upward with effort, lifting his arm just enough to tug at the thin silver chain on his wrist, the one that held his military tag. His fingers clumsy now, shaking, he pointed toward it with what little strength he had left. "ID, check the ID," he said, voice, hoarse, lips dry. "I'm Navy, Commander Walter Dean. My house is right there." He gestured with a faint motion of his chin toward the corner where the mailbox still bore his family's name in gold vinyl letters. Mason's legs felt like lead as he moved closer, the adrenaline now washing into nausea. He knelt beside the wounded man, fingers hesitating over the chain, eyes scanning for the ID tag he barely believed could be real. But it was there, stamped metal military-issued name, engraved in clear block letters, alongside a service number and the unmistakable insignia of the United States Navy. The word commander etched into the surface hit him like a blow. "Jesus Christ," Mason muttered, voice cracking as the full weight of recognition landed on him. "What did I just do?" Walter closed his eyes for a moment, breathing shallow and uneven, trying to hold on. His body was going limp, and he knew he was losing too much blood too fast. "Call someone," he said, barely audible. "Tell my wife, Teresa. She'll be looking for me." Mason staggered to his feet, backing away as if the sidewalk itself had turned into a crime scene, which it had, except this time he wasn't the one investigating, he was the one responsible. He fumbled for his radio, fingers slipping once, then twice before he found the button. "Dispatch officer down, no correction shots fired. Civilian hit. I need an ambulance. Now. The man's been shot by me. He's military. Commander, it's bad." His voice cracked mid-sentence, filled with panic. He couldn't mask the authority gone, replaced by a trembling boy who had broken something irreversible. The dispatcher responded calm and procedural, but Mason barely heard the words. He was staring at the blood pooling beneath the man's side, bright against the concrete, shockingly vivid under the early morning sun. Walter's mind drifted in waves between awareness and blur, his thoughts flickering like pages in a windstorm. He thought of his wife's voice that morning, the warmth of her hand on his shoulder before he'd left. He thought of their daughter's graduation photo on the hallway wall, the way the frame tilted slightly, because he kept forgetting to fix the nail. He thought of the Veterans Center, the young man he'd promised to call this afternoon, the breakfast sandwich he hadn't gotten to finish. And somewhere under the fog, beneath the pain and fear, a single thought rose clear and bitter. After all these years, after all that service, he was still just a black man, bleeding on a sidewalk, while someone with a badge stood over him with shaking hands. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, now growing louder, closer, and Walter tried to focus on that sound, tried to let it anchor him to something solid. Mason stood a few feet away, pacing in small, frantic circles, gun now holstered, hands wiping down his face, like that could erase what had just happened. He glanced at Walter again, then down at the ID, still resting in his palm. "I didn't know," he whispered, as if those words could undo the damage. "I swear I didn't know." But Walter didn't answer. He had heard that line before on the news, in stories told by widows and daughters and friends standing at funerals for men who looked like him. And every time it rang hollow. He didn't need Mason to know who he was. He needed Mason to see that it shouldn't have mattered. The sirens drew closer, now bouncing off houses and car hoods, breaking the morning wide open. Somewhere behind, the sound dogs barked, and porch lights flicked on. The neighborhood was waking up to a tragedy that had been waiting quietly to unfold. And there, at the center of it, Walter Dean lay still, breathing, still bleeding, but still, against all odds, alive. The news spread faster than sirens could finish their echo, first whispered between neighbors stepping onto porches in robes and slippers, then rushed into smartphones, police scanners, and quiet gasps behind kitchen windows where coffee had just been poured. By the time the ambulance pulled away from Sycamore Lane with Commander Walter Dean strapped to a gurney, blood still seeping through the bandages wrapped hastily around his shoulder, the quiet suburban calm had unraveled into something colder, sharper, and irreversible. A few residents stood by the curb, arms folded across their chests, eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed in a place they once believed was immune to this kind of violence. Inside the ambulance, Walter drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain coming in waves, each one heavier than the last, but his mind clung to a single thread: stay awake, stay aware, don't let this be the end of your story. He heard voices above him, muffled yet urgent, paramedics speaking in clipped commands about vitals and pressure loss, and someone asking, "Do we have a name?" His lips moved before he could think. "Walter Dean, Navy Commander, my wife, Teresa Dean. Tell her I'm alive." The words weren't just identifiers, they were declarations, proof that he was still a man, still more than the bloodstain someone mistook him for. Back on the ground, Officer Mason Cole stood apart from his fellow officers, hands shaking, lips pale, the weight of what he had done pressing down like wet concrete across his chest. He couldn't stop replaying the moment, the raised hand, the slight shoulder shift, the split-second judgment that unraveled everything. One of the senior officers tried to speak with him, calm him down, offer protocol. "You'll need to come in. There'll be statements. Internal review. Union reps already been called." But Mason barely nodded his ears, ringing not from sirens now but from guilt, disbelief, and a fear he no longer knew how to name. By mid-morning, local news vans were circling the neighborhood like vultures over a story they could already sense was bigger than just a shooting. Breaking news out of Crestwood, one anchor would soon report: a black military veteran shot by a local officer while jogging in his own neighborhood. The words played on repeat across televisions, in barbershops, living rooms, and office break rooms before anyone had time to spin the narrative. And within hours, it wasn't just local, it was national. Photos of Walter in uniform began appearing online, stern-faced and decorated, standing tall at ceremonies, saluting beside the American flag. Headlines followed suit: retired Navy commander shot in suburb while jogging. Another case of mistaken identity, or something worse. At the Veterans Center downtown, news of the shooting arrived like a slap. Jamal, a 26-year-old Marine Walter had been mentoring for months, dropped his coffee cup when he saw Walter's face on the screen. "That's Commander Dean," he whispered, pointing at the television. "That's him. That's the guy who helped me get housing. That's the guy who got my court date moved." Around him, silence fell heavy. Every veteran in that room knew what the uniform meant. They also knew what it meant to be seen without it. One older vet, an amputee in a wheelchair, shook his head slowly and muttered. They didn't see the ribbons, they saw the skin. By noon, calls had begun flooding the local police department. Journalists, activists, city officials, and members of the public all demanding answers. Who gave the order? Why wasn't de-escalation used? What threat did an unarmed man in jogging clothes really pose? And underneath all of that noise, there was something quieter but sharper, rising: a sense of betrayal from a community that had trusted its officers to know the difference between suspicion and bias, between fear and judgment. Teresa Dean sat in the hospital waiting room with their daughter Darlene, both of them gripping each other's hands in silence. She hadn't cried yet, not really. Not the way people do in movies or on television. Her tears hadn't come with sobs or screams. They'd come in quiet, breathless moments in the elevator up to ICU, in the nurse's gentle voice, explaining his condition in the sight of his shoes folded neatly under the hospital bed. "He was just jogging," Darlene whispered for the 10th time. "He does that every morning. Same route, same time. Why today?" But there was no answer. Just the steady beep of the monitor on the other side of the door. Outside the hospital, a crowd had begun to gather. It wasn't a protest, at least not yet, but it was a presence. Veterans holding flags upside down, a symbol of distress. Neighbors holding signs that read, "I jog here too." A few stood in silent prayer. Some simply watched, arms crossed, as reporters angled cameras and police cruisers lingered nearby. What had started as a single tragic mistake was becoming something else, something harder to contain. A mirror had been held up to the city, and what it reflected was a discomfort too big to ignore. And somewhere in a quiet room lit only by the slow pulse of a heart monitor, Walter Dean breathed through the pain and held on, not just for himself but for the storm he knew was coming. The call reached the Department of Justice before the midday traffic had even begun to settle, cutting through layers of bureaucracy like a hot blade, through wax: urgent, official, undeniable. It wasn't just the report of a police-involved shooting. It was the name attached to the victim that lit fires behind closed doors across Washington. Commander Walter Dean, decorated Navy officer, veteran of 3 overseas deployments, recipient of the Legion of Merit and Bronze Star, had been shot by a patrol officer while jogging in his own neighborhood. The case didn't just register as another tragic entry in a long list. It registered as something far more personal, far more volatile, and immediately political. The Pentagon was briefed within the hour, and by the time the local mayor gave his first guarded statement to the press, federal eyes were already watching, listening, and quietly preparing to step in. Inside a small, windowless office on the 4th floor of the Justice Building, Assistant Attorney General Marcy Lane stood with her arms crossed, rereading the incident summary for the 3rd time, her expression tightening with every line. She had handled civil rights violations before, had built cases against rogue officers and corrupt precincts, but something about this one hit her differently, not just because of Walter's military record, but because of the silence surrounding the officer's name, the vague language in the department's first statement, and the telltale signs of a narrative already being sanitized. He was jogging. That's all he was doing, she said quietly to her aide. And he got shot. That alone demands our full weight. By mid-afternoon, a federal investigative team was assembled, one part from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, another from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and a third drawn from the Office of Military Legal Affairs. They weren't there to observe. They were there to take control. The Alexandria Police Department, already floundering under public pressure, was notified that the case had been elevated to a matter of federal oversight, and that all body camera footage, patrol car, dash recordings, radio logs, and internal personnel files would be subject to immediate review. There was no room for stonewalling, no space for internal spin. The message was clear: this wouldn't be another case handled behind closed doors, lost in paperwork and public fatigue. This would be exposed, dissected, and judged with full transparency. At the precinct, tension thickened like smoke. Officers moved slower, quieter, casting glances that hovered somewhere between guilt and resentment. Mason Cole had been placed on administrative leave, his badge and service weapon turned over without protest. Though the moment had left him pale, hollow, and visibly shaken, he sat alone in an interview room, fingers tapping a slow, erratic rhythm against the table's edge, staring down at the laminated surface as though it held the answers he couldn't articulate. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, once barely audible. "It happened fast." But no one in the building could say that aloud without hearing how hollow it sounded. At the hospital, Walter's condition had stabilized, though the pain remained sharp and unrelenting, a dull burn that pulsed through his upper body with every shallow breath. Teresa sat beside his bed, her hand gently resting on his, her thumb tracing small circles over his knuckles, both to comfort him and to remind herself that he was still alive, still hers. Darlene stood near the window, arms folded, jaw clenched, watching the sun inch slowly across the sky, like time had taken on weight. When an FBI agent arrived to take Walter's preliminary statement, the room fell silent, the air suddenly charged with something more than just legal necessity. "Take your time," the agent said, softly, voice low and even. "We're here to get this right." Walter's voice was raspy, fragile, but unwavering. He recounted the jog, the sudden stop, the flashing lights, the way the officer never asked his name. "I told him," he said slowly, eyes steady on the agent. "I told him I lived here. I told him I was military. I pointed to my ID and he still fired. He didn't see a man. He saw a threat. That's what he pulled the trigger on." The agent nodded, taking notes carefully, methodically, but Walter could see it in her face. The shift, the realization that this was not a man exaggerating or playing for sympathy. This was a man recounting something he'd feared might happen for years but never imagined would come true. As she closed her notebook, she met his eyes and said, "We're going to treat this like what it is, a federal civil rights case. And you're not alone in this." Outside, the pressure kept building. National veterans organizations issued formal statements demanding accountability. Congressional leaders, including 2 senators who had served in the military, called for a public hearing into law enforcement's use of force against veterans of color. Social media campaigns erupted under the hashtags #JusticeForCommanderDean and #JoggingWhileBlack, fueled by images of Walter in uniform beside pictures of his blood-stained shirt. The contrast was jarring, impossible to ignore, and for many Americans, especially older ones who had once worn a uniform themselves, it struck a nerve long protected by silence. In the background of all this noise, Walter lay quietly in his hospital bed, aware that the world had changed again, but this time not because of a battlefield or a foreign war. This time it had changed because of a sidewalk, because of a glance, because of a choice. And as the wind shifted outside the window, rustling the blinds in slow waves, he whispered to himself, "This isn't just about me anymore." And it wasn't. It never had been. The evidence didn't shout it, whispered slowly and precisely like truth often does when it has nothing left to prove. The body camera footage from Officer Mason Cole's vest was time-stamped, reviewed, duplicated, and secured by the federal team within hours of the DOJ assuming control of the case. There were no missing minutes, no technical errors, no reason for redactions. It was all there beginning to end, unedited, unavoidable, undeniable. The camera lens didn't blink when fear flared. In Mason's eyes didn't look away when the gun was drawn too fast, didn't flinch when the bullet struck Commander Walter Dean in the shoulder, and sent him to the pavement like the closing chapter of a book no one had wanted to read. Inside, a small temperature-controlled room at the regional FBI headquarters, 2 agents and 1 forensic video analyst sat in silence as the footage played back on a wall-mounted screen. The image crystal clear, the sound cutting through every breath, every word, every misjudgment. No one spoke for the first few minutes. The silence in the room was respectful, not just for the victim but for the reality. They were now tasked with translating into a courtroom narrative. What they saw wasn't chaos. It was order, an order rooted in bias, playing out calmly, methodically, and with a kind of rehearsed violence that could only come from a man who didn't expect to be questioned. The jogger appeared in the footage just as described: Commander Dean's steady-pace gray t-shirt, no sudden movements, no outward signs of distress or danger. The patrol car eased into the frame, angled in sharply, blocking the sidewalk without warning. Mason Cole's voice was loud, firm, but edged with something tighter, an urgency that wasn't based on observation but on assumption. "Stop right there. Hands where I can see them." Walter's hands were visible. His tone was level. "I live here," he said. "Just jogging. 2 blocks from home." He raised his left arm, slowly pointing toward his wrist, toward the military ID tag he always wore, when running a quiet precaution that suddenly became the center of everything. In the footage, you could see the subtle stretch of fabric across his shoulder, the way he shifted slightly, perhaps out of habit, perhaps to ease the pull on an old service injury. It was a human movement, unarmed, unthreatening, and yet it triggered something deep and uncontrollable in the officer holding the gun. "Put your hands down, don't move, stop." Cole's voice cracked. His hand tightened. The shot rang out seconds later. There was no moment of visible aggression from Walter. No forward motion, no charge, no clenched fist, no sharp reach. He stood there, calm, compliant, confused, and then suddenly bleeding. The silence that followed the gunshot in the video felt heavier than the sound itself, like the world had suddenly taken a breath it couldn't release. The agents in the room didn't rewind the footage immediately. They sat with it, sat with what it revealed, not just about Mason Cole, but about the layers beneath every routine stop that ends in tragedy. Later that day, the audio from the dash camera added another dimension, proving that Mason Cole had spoken to dispatch only after the shot was fired, only after Walter was already on the ground, clutching his shoulder and identifying himself through ragged breaths. "He said he's Navy, said he's a commander," Cole muttered into the radio, his voice hollow, fragmented like a man waking up inside his own mistake. "Didn't look like it. I didn't know." That final sentence, captured in perfect digital clarity, would later be played to a jury, words that carried not just the echo of regret, but the weight of everything wrong with what happened. In the days that followed, the DOJ released a tightly worded statement confirming the video's contents and acknowledging substantial evidence of excessive use of force and racial profiling. It was rare for them to speak so directly, but the evidence allowed no ambiguity. Behind closed doors, senior DOJ officials, in coordination with Pentagon representatives, agreed that this case could not would not be treated like just another police misconduct investigation. "This isn't about just one officer," someone said during a strategy meeting. "This is about a system that saw a man in a gray t-shirt as a threat and forgot to look for the soldier underneath." Meanwhile, Walter Dean lay in his hospital room, a remote in hand, watching coverage he never asked to be a part of. Every frame of the footage had become public, now broken down on news channels, debated by commentators, dissected by strangers. But for him, it wasn't a headline. It was a memory unshakable, quiet, and deeply personal. He watched himself on screen, standing calmly speaking, clearly trying to live through something that should have never happened. "They see the tape now," Teresa said gently from beside him. "They see what really happened." Walter nodded once slowly, but his gaze didn't leave the screen. "What they do with it," he whispered, "is what matters next." And in that moment, surrounded by IV drips and quiet hums of machines, Commander Dean wasn't just a victim reclaiming truth, he was a witness watching the country watch itself. The courtroom didn't buzz with chaos, it pulsed with something quieter, something slower, like the heavy breath of a place holding its composure just long enough to pretend it still believed in justice. The walls were thick with history and polished with routine, yet nothing about the case unfolding inside them felt routine at all. Every pew was filled veterans in pressed uniforms, local residents in silence, journalists scribbling behind laptop screens, and Walter Dean's family sitting in the second row, hands clasped shoulders, squared hearts, weighed down by both dread and resolve. And when the bailiff called the court to order, it was as if the air itself stiffened. Mason Cole entered from the side door, his steps short, shoulders hunched, wearing a suit that looked too big and a face that looked too small for the moment. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't even look at Walter. His gaze remained fixed ahead, not out of defiance, but because eye contact would have made the truth settle deeper than he was prepared to bear. His defense team flanked him, whispering strategy, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves as if anything could soften the facts laid bare by the footage. The prosecutor, a tall woman with steady eyes and a measured voice, rose with the calm of someone who understood the stakes, not just in legal terms, but in human ones. She didn't waste time with drama. No grand opening, no fiery condemnation. She began instead by introducing Walter not as a victim, but as a man. Navy commander, father, husband, community leader, neighbor. She showed the video slowly, pausing only when necessary, letting the room watch absorb ache. When the shot rang out on screen, there was no gasp, no cry, just a collective stillness that said everything louder than any sound could. Walter sat upright during the playback, his jaw set, eyes focused, not blinking more than he had to. It wasn't easy watching himself stagger, collapse, bleed. But he had insisted on being present for it, had said to his wife, "If I could survive it once, I can survive it again. But this time they'll all see," and they did. They saw his calm posture, his slow movements, his clear words, his attempt to identify himself. And they saw the bullet tear through all of that, through years of service, through layers of dignity, through every attempt to prove his place in a country that kept asking him to prove it again. Mason's defense team tried to frame the event as a tragic misjudgment, a split-second reaction from a young officer caught in what he believed to be a high-risk situation. They played up the stress of night shifts, the dangers of patrol work, the ambiguity of body language. One lawyer even said, "In that moment, Officer Cole feared for his life." That fear may have been flawed, but it was real. But when he looked toward the jury, he could see it in their faces. They weren't buying it. Fear without reason had stopped being a defense a long time ago, and in this room it sounded more like an excuse than an explanation. On the third day of the trial, Walter took the stand. The room was silent in the way a church is silent before a eulogy. He wore a dark blue blazer over a white shirt, Metal's absent posture dignified. His voice was slow but unwavering, his tone not bitter but deliberate, each sentence shaped by clarity, not vengeance. "I followed every order," he said. "I did not argue. I did not run. I raised my hands. I told him I was military. I showed him my ID. He didn't listen. He looked at me and saw a threat, not a man." He paused there, letting the weight of his words settle, then added more softly, "I've served in combat zones where I trusted strangers not to shoot me, but I was shot 2 blocks from my home by someone paid to protect me." His eyes scanned the jury, but he wasn't pleading. He was asking them to carry the truth, not just for him, but for everyone who looked like him and had walked that same tightrope of suspicion and survival. In cross-examination, the defense tried to shake his testimony, but it was like throwing pebbles at a stone wall. Walter never flinched. When asked if he could have moved in a way that appeared threatening, he answered, "I adjusted my shoulder, not because I was hiding something, because I was hurting. That's what 30 years of service does to a body." When asked if he could forgive Mason Cole, he paused not to perform but to reflect, then said quietly, "Forgiveness is a personal thing. Justice, though, that's public." Outside, the courthouse cameras waited, but inside, everything stayed focused, grounded by the presence of a man who had come not to avenge himself but to affirm the truth. The jurors took notes, their expressions sober, some nodding, others swallowing emotion, all of them, knowing this case wasn't just about facts, it was about responsibility, about whether the country they lived in could admit when it had failed someone who had given it everything. By the end of the week, testimonies from fellow veterans poured in statements about Walter's character, his work with young vets, his efforts to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the black community. None of them were dramatic. They were simply honest. One young Marine put it best on the stand when he said, "Commander Dean was the first man who made me feel like coming home didn't mean becoming invisible." And they almost took that from him. For what a hoodie a glance, and as the courtroom recessed that evening with the judge's gavel echoing softly through the wood-paneled walls, it became clear that this trial wasn't just uncovering what had happened that morning on Sycamore Lane. It was putting the very soul of the system under oath. And this time, the truth wasn't going to back down. The courtroom had changed by the time Walter Dean took the stand. Something in the air felt heavier, quieter, as if even the walls had decided to listen. The afternoon sun cast long, slanted beams through the narrow windows, cutting across the polished wood floors in golden ribbons. But inside the witness box, there was no warmth, only focus gravity, and a kind of stillness that wrapped itself around the man seated there like a uniform he no longer needed to wear. He straightened his back, slowly placed both hands on the edges of the polished rail before him, and drew in a breath that seemed to stretch across the room. He had testified before Congress, before commanding officers, before foreign leaders, but never like this, never with this weight pressing against his chest. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor asked, voice steady. Walter didn't hesitate. "Commander Walter Dean, United States Navy, retired." A ripple moved through the gallery, just a breath, just a shift, but enough to signal that this wasn't just a witness taking the stand. This was a man bringing 30 years of disciplined silence into public hearing. He wasn't there to impress, he wasn't there to punish, he was there to speak plainly, to say aloud what had lived too long in the spaces between assumptions and apologies. "I jogged that morning," he began, voice low but unwavering. "The same route I've jogged every morning for years. I woke up at 5:30, tied my shoes like always, kissed my wife goodbye like always. And I walked out of my own front door believing I would come back the same way." His hands didn't tremble, but the knuckles tightened slightly as he spoke, not from anger but from holding back the deeper ache that no words could fully express. He described the flashing lights, the sudden command to freeze the voice that arrived, not with curiosity but accusation. "He didn't ask who I was," Walter said quietly. "He didn't ask what I was doing. He pointed a gun at me and made a decision." There was no theatrics in his telling, only precision, the kind learned in years of writing reports that might be reviewed by generals or senators. He recounted how he raised his hands slowly, how he tried to explain himself, how he gestured to the ID on his wrist, how the pain came fast and hot and unimaginable. He didn't see the man who trained soldiers. He didn't see the man who buried friends overseas, Walter said. He didn't even see the man who pays property taxes in the same zip code. His gaze moved across the jury box, and for a moment you could hear nothing but the soft hum of the air vent overhead, the scratch of a pen on a notepad, the quiet ache of understanding beginning to settle into each listener. The defense attorney stood up next, adjusted his tie nervously, and approached the stand with the caution of someone walking across thin ice. He asked whether Walter might have moved too quickly, whether the officer might have interpreted his motion as a threat, whether in that one moment fear might have been justified. Walter paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted the right one to land exactly as it needed to. "I have known fear," he replied evenly. "Real fear. Fear on ships that shake in midnight storms. Fear in combat zones where life hangs on a whispered decision. I know the difference between fear and panic." What he felt wasn't fear. It was a story he brought with him. A story written long before I ever stepped into his view. His voice never rose, but it carried farther than anything shouted could have. Even the judge, leaning forward slightly, now seemed to register that this was no longer just testimony. It was reckoning. Teresa watched from the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable but her posture fierce, like a woman who had carried not just grief but 1,000 small injustices that never made headline. Darlene sat beside her, eyes locked on her father, tears held tightly in the rims of her eyes but never falling. Around them, people didn't fidget or cough or whisper. They just listened, because there are moments when silence is the only appropriate response to truth. Near the end of his testimony, Walter glanced once toward Mason Cole, not out of anger, but out of something quieter, more sobering. "You made a choice," he said, voice firm, but not cruel. "Not in a split second, not in panic. The choice happened long before your hand touched that gun. The choice was how you saw me. And you didn't see a man worth protecting." He paused there just long enough. "But I'm still here. And now you have to see me." The prosecutor said no further questions. The judge nodded. Walter stepped down slowly. His steps measured his shoulders steady, not because he had won anything, but because he had endured, and in doing so had made visible what so many had tried to look away from. And as he returned to his seat beside his family, the courtroom didn't erupt, didn't applaud, didn't move. It simply remained in silence, because some truths don't ask for reaction. They just ask to be heard. The jury deliberation room was a small, windowless space with pale walls and chairs that creaked whenever someone shifted under the weight of thought. 12 people sat in a circle, each carrying the weight of testimony, the weight of a man's blood, and the weight of a country's long history coiled around one morning on one quiet street. For nearly 8 hours they talked not just about what they saw, but what they felt, what they feared, what they hoped justice could still mean in a world where the truth sometimes arrives late and limping. By the time the foreman rang the bell, the sun had dipped low behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble steps outside, where reporters and civilians gathered their voices, subdued their phones, ready, waiting for a verdict that would carry more than just legal consequence. Inside the courtroom, the crowd returned to their benches with the hush of a congregation awaiting prayer, and Walter Dean sat once more beside his wife, his hand resting atop hers, fingers woven together not just from love, but endurance. The judge returned to the bench with solemn eyes and steady hands, and when the jury filed back in, you could almost hear the room holding its breath. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a suit wrinkled from hours of sitting, and cleared his throat before speaking. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, he said, "We, the jury, find the defendant Mason Cole guilty." A quiet gasp moved through the gallery, not loud but sharp, like a seam splitting under pressure. On the charge of unlawful use of force by a public officer, guilty. On the charge of federal civil rights violation, guilty. Mason didn't react at first. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, jaw, tight shoulders drawn inward, as if trying to make himself smaller. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, but he didn't flinch or respond. There were no outbursts, no cries of protest, only a thick, unspoken understanding that what had happened on that sidewalk would not be buried by paperwork or rationalized into irrelevance. Walter didn't cry. He didn't clench his fists or raise his chin in defiance. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, exhaled, and opened them again. More a release than a celebration, more a recognition that accountability, though rare, was not impossible. Teresa squeezed his hand gently, and in that silent gesture, they both acknowledged what had been won and what had been lost. The judge called for a short recess before sentencing, and when the court reconvened, the mood had changed once again. The gallery was still full, but the tension had softened, replaced by the anticipation of something final, something lasting. Mason stood now beside his lawyer, his tie loosened slightly, his hands clasped in front of him, eyes still downcast. The prosecutor rose one last time and spoke with the same calm clarity she'd maintained throughout the trial. "Your Honor," she began, "this was not a case of a mistake made in darkness. It was a case of daylight discrimination. A man obeyed every instruction. A man complied. A man identified himself. And still he was shot." She paused, letting the silence fill the room again before continuing. That man was not just a military officer, not just a father or husband. He was an American citizen walking in his own neighborhood. The sentence must reflect not just the law, but the message we send to every community watching this unfold. Then Walter was invited to speak not as a witness, but as a survivor. He stood slowly, the stiffness in his shoulders still present, but his steps measured and composed. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. "I don't need this court to restore my dignity," he said quietly, "because it was never taken from me. What I need is for the law to recognize that dignity should not require proof of service, proof of innocence, or proof of humanity. It should be given freely, equally, always." He looked at Mason then, not with hate, but with a kind of tired honesty. "You didn't just pull a trigger. You pulled away every assumption I had that being good, being disciplined, being quiet would protect me. And maybe that's the real crime here, not the pain you caused me, but the fear you confirmed in others." The judge nodded slowly, hands folded, eyes reflecting not just judgment but reflection. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the deliberate weight of someone who understood. The moment was larger than himself. "This court finds," he said, "that the defendant's actions constituted not only a criminal offense but a profound betrayal of public trust and human decency. A betrayal rooted not in panic but in prejudice, not in danger but in misjudgment. Therefore, the court sentences Mason Cole to 30 years in federal prison." The room didn't erupt. It sank into breath, into relief, into a silence that felt full, not empty. Mason's knees buckled slightly as the bailiff stepped forward, his hands shaking as the cuffs clicked closed. He didn't look back as he was led out, just one step after another, into the corridor, into the consequence, into the long echo of his own decision. Walter remained seated, breathing slowly, his wife still holding his hand. Around them, people rose not for applause, but because sometimes standing is the only way to honor what cannot be undone. And as they exited the courtroom together side by side, the afternoon sun had returned, casting a new light over everything that remained. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, but Walter Dean still felt the echo of the judge's voice bouncing gently in the back of his mind, calm, firm, unflinching. 30 years. Not just a sentence, but a measure of weight, of consequence, of recognition that what happened to him mattered not only because he had survived, but because it had been named for what it truly was. The hallway outside the courtroom was dim now, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering occasionally like tired eyes refusing to sleep. He sat on a bench near the exit shoulders, slightly hunched elbows resting on his knees, hands folded not in prayer but in exhaustion. Teresa sat beside him in silence, her hand resting on his back, moving in slow circles, grounding him in the kind of quiet only long marriages understand. He didn't say much, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because too much had already been said. His body felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with pain or fatigue, and everything to do with the gravity of having been seen, heard, and believed. Justice, he realized, didn't come with a parade or a spotlight. It came like breath after drowning, necessary, painful, and disorienting. "You okay?" Teresa asked, her voice soft, low, the way she used to speak to him when he woke from night terrors in the early years after deployment. He nodded, once barely. "I think I will be," he said. "Not tonight, but maybe soon." Outside the courthouse steps were quiet now. The crowd dispersed. The media vans packed up the protest signs, left, leaning against lampposts like forgotten shields after a long campaign. A few candles still burned on the edge of the sidewalk where someone had placed a photo of him in uniform beside a handwritten sign that simply read, "We believe you, Commander." That sign, more than the sentence, more than the verdict, stuck with him. It reminded him that belief was not something easily won in his lifetime, and that being believed was in its own way a revolution. The next morning he stood in his kitchen, pouring coffee with a hand that still trembled slightly from the nerve damage in his shoulder. The house was quiet, the morning light soft against the countertop, and for a few seconds it almost felt like any other day. But it wasn't. His body reminded him with every motion, every breath, every stretch. He moved slower now, but more deliberately, as if each action required a small personal permission. When he stepped out to the porch, a neighbor across the street raised a hand and called out, "We watched it all, sir. You carried that courtroom with dignity." Walter nodded in return, not because he needed the recognition, but because he had learned long ago that sometimes acknowledgement was a way of passing the burden forward. Later that week, the judge called a special hearing, not for the sentence, but for restitution. A final piece of accountability, a financial recognition of harm, the kind that didn't erase what was done but at least documented it in terms the system could understand. Walter sat quietly as the numbers were read aloud: medical bills, therapy, long-term physical, rehabilitation, emotional trauma. $60,000. The courtroom was less crowded that day, but the few who returned sat with straight backs and attentive eyes. The judge read his final ruling without fanfare, his voice as steady as it had been throughout the trial. "Restitution," he said, "does not make a man whole, but it does make clear that this court has seen what happened and placed value on the injury not just to the body but to the dignity." Walter didn't flinch at the number. He didn't care about money. What mattered to him was that someone had finally written it down formally, permanently, in the record of this country's imperfect attempt at justice. After the hearing, as they exited the building one last time, Teresa slipped her arm through his and whispered, "It's over now." But Walter shook his head gently. "No," he said, "it's written down now. That's not the same as over. It just means it's finally begun." He spent the next few days in reflection, not because he was searching for meaning, but because he needed to reassemble who he was outside of the trial, outside of the wound, outside of the identity that had been assigned to him without his consent. In the evenings he sat by the window in the study, reading old letters from his Navy days, notes from soldiers he had mentored, thank you cards from families he barely remembered helping. They grounded him. They reminded him that he had lived a life before this moment, and that this moment, however large, would not define the full measure of his story. One night, while sorting through a box of medals and faded photographs, he paused over a small note his daughter had written when she was 12, crayon letters on lined paper spelling out, "You're my hero, Daddy." He hadn't cried in weeks, hadn't let himself bend, but that note bent him. Not from pain, but from something quieter, grace. The understanding that while justice was delivered in court, healing would have to come in moments like this in rooms no one else would ever see. And so when the phone rang a few days later, with a request for him to speak at the local university, a lecture hall full of criminal justice students, he paused for only a second before saying yes. Because stories like his, when told with calm, when told without vengeance, could change the shape of how people see each other. And perhaps that was the final step toward justice, not just to be heard, but to teach others how to listen. The auditorium wasn't grand, just rows of folding chairs and a modest wooden podium with a microphone that squeaked when adjusted. But to Walter Dean, it felt more daunting than any courtroom he had entered. The walls were plain, lit by soft fluorescence, and the air smelled faintly of old books and warm coffee. Around 100 students sat waiting, most in sweatshirts and sneakers, notebooks resting on their laps, phones discreetly dimmed but still ready. These were future police officers, social workers, public defenders, young faces that would one day carry authority whether they realized it yet or not. Walter stood at the edge of the small stage, one hand resting on the lectern, the other brushing his side lightly, where the pain still flared on cold mornings. He looked out at the crowd, not searching for admiration, just a point of focus. The room was quiet, respectful, not in awe but in attention. They knew who he was. They'd read the articles, seen the headlines, but now he stood in front of them in person, tall, calm, older than most of them imagined, wearing a navy blazer over a simple gray sweater, the kind of man who didn't demand space but naturally filled it. He began not with the story of the shooting, but with a story from decades earlier, his first deployment, the silence of a midnight ocean, the weight of command, when lives depended on your decisions. "You learn quickly," he said, voice smooth but firm, "that authority without responsibility is just noise. Real leadership is about seeing before you react, listening before you speak." Some students nodded, others scribbled, but most just watched him, sensing that this wasn't a speech. It was a lesson lived in the bones. When he did speak of that morning, Sycamore Lane, the patrol car, the bullet, he did so without drama, without bitterness, but not without weight. He described how quickly calm had become chaos, how assumptions became action, how silence had almost become death. He paused between sentences, not for effect, but for breath, as if each word still carried a fragment of that day's air. "He saw me," Walter said, "but he didn't see me. He saw the shape of fear he'd been taught to recognize, not the man I am." A woman in the third row raised her hand, hesitant. "Do you think he was racist?" she asked softly, "or just scared?" Walter didn't answer right away. He leaned back slightly, tilted his head, and looked at her, the way a teacher looks at a student who's asked the question that matters most. "Fear doesn't erase responsibility," he said slowly. "And racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind training and policy, but it always reveals itself in choices." That landed with them not as accusation but as truth. And when he spoke about healing, he didn't describe it as something beautiful or cinematic. He spoke of physical therapy appointments, nights without sleep, the sound of his wife breathing beside him when memory threatened to drag him back. He spoke of his daughter's silence, of how it took her weeks to stop flinching every time a police car passed. Healing, he told them, wasn't a straight line. It was a commitment, a decision to not let bitterness finish what injustice had started. After the talk, students formed a line not to take pictures or ask for autographs, but just to say thank you quietly, as if what he had given them wasn't a story but a kind of permission. One young man, barely 20, with sharp eyes and nervous hands, looked up at Walter and said, "I'm going to the academy next month. I don't want to be that kind of cop." Walter placed a hand gently on the young man's shoulder and nodded. "Then start by seeing people," he said. "Before you see their record, before you see their clothes, before you see their color." As the room emptied and the last echoes of conversation faded into the hallway, Walter remained for a moment longer alone on the stage, letting the silence settle around him like the end of a prayer. He had come not to tell his story again, but to hand it over, to let it live in other voices, in other choices. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky tinged with early evening gold, and the world went on as it always had. But somewhere out there, he knew, a few minds had shifted just enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was how justice really began, not with verdicts or headlines, but with the quiet decisions made by those who choose to see. What happened to Commander Walter Dean isn't just a story about one man or one moment, it's a mirror held up to all of us. It's about how deeply rooted bias can cost dignity, freedom, and nearly a life. It reminds us that doing everything right, serving your country, following the rules, staying calm, still isn't enough when someone chooses not to see your humanity. But it's also about what happens when truth is pursued with courage, when justice is no longer whispered but spoken aloud in full voice. In a world where fear and judgment move faster than reason, we need to slow down to see clearly, to listen fully. Whether you're in uniform or not, your choices carry weight. Whether you're in power or not, your silence shapes the world. And no matter how dark it gets, accountability is possible, but only if we demand it, name it, and refuse to look away. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of someone you care about, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, pass it on, talk about it with your family, your neighbors, your community. Because the more we speak up, the fewer stories like this will ever need to be told again. If you believe in stories that matter, stories that speak truth, restore dignity, and call for change, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more voices that refuse to stay silent. You're watching for a reason. Let your voice be part of the reason this never happens again.